It was a quiet Tuesday morning in Montgomery. The sun filtered gently through the oak trees lining the historic district, and 73-year-old Loretta James drove her black Lincoln slowly down Monroe Street. Dressed in a navy blue pantsuit with a silver pin on her collar, she kept both hands steady on the wheel. Her mind was on the courthouse, not as a visitor, but as one of its most respected figures. She had just pulled out of a parking lot when she noticed flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Sighing, she guided the car to the side of the road and rolled her window down halfway. The officer stepped out of his cruiser. Tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing reflective sunglasses, he approached Loretta's car with stiff posture. "License and registration," he said curtly, barely looking at her. Loretta kept calm. "Is there a reason I was pulled over, officer?" "I'll ask the questions," he replied sharply. "You were driving suspiciously slow. You been drinking this morning?" Her eyebrows lifted. "Excuse me. Just hand over your ID. I'll run it and be on my way, unless you want to make this more difficult." Loretta didn't flinch. She calmly handed over her license and said, "I suggest you do that." The officer snatched the ID, turned on his heel, and walked back to his car, muttering something under his breath. What happened next would change the entire tone of the encounter. Officer Brent Walker slid into the seat of his cruiser, tossed the ID onto the dash, and pulled up the patrol system. "Loretta James," he muttered, typing her name. As the database loaded, his brow furrowed. Her photo popped up, same composed face, same silver pin, but next to her name was a title that made his stomach clench. Supreme Court Justice, Alabama State Supreme Court. He blinked, then read it again. Not a retired judge. Not a visiting clerk. A sitting Supreme Court Justice. His hand hovered over the radio. His breathing grew shallow. Back at the Lincoln, Justice James sat with a quiet poise, her fingers folded on the steering wheel. She wasn't angry. She'd seen this before, the assumption, the dismissive tone, the barking commands. But she had learned long ago that authority worn loud was often a mask for insecurity. A minute later, Officer Walker stepped back to her window. His demeanor had changed completely. He had taken off his sunglasses, his voice now uncertain. "Ma'am. I apologize. There seems to have been a mistake." Justice James tilted her head slightly. "What part was the mistake? Pulling me over, or the way you addressed me?" I didn't realize who you were," he stammered. "That shouldn't have mattered," she replied calmly. He stood frozen, unsure of what to say next. She gently took back her license from his hand. "You might want to consider the tone you use when you speak to people. You never know who they are. Or what they stand for." The silence hung heavy between them. Then, without raising her voice, she added, "You can step back now, officer. I believe I'm free to go." He nodded quickly, taking 2 steps away. She rolled up her window and pulled away with grace. But this wasn't the end, not for her, and certainly not for him. Back at the precinct, Officer Walker couldn't shake the interaction. As he typed up his daily report, he left out the more uncomfortable details of the stop. But the tension in his chest didn't let up. By mid-afternoon, word had already spread. "You pulled over who?" asked Deputy Morales, glancing over the cubicle wall with raised eyebrows. Walker leaned back, trying to look casual. "Didn't recognize her at first. She wasn't in any official vehicle." "She doesn't need to be," Morales said with a chuckle. "That woman sits higher than anyone in this building. She practically signs our fate." Walker tried to brush it off, but the look from Morales told him the story wouldn't die here. Meanwhile, Justice James returned to her chambers. Her law clerk, Maya, met her at the door. "Everything all right, ma'am?" she asked, noticing the slight tension in Loretta's jaw. "Minor delay," Justice James replied. "But it reminded me why the robe matters." Maya nodded slowly, sensing more behind the words. Justice James took her seat behind the polished oak desk, her expression now composed but sharper than before. She opened her calendar, eyes scanning an upcoming date circled in red: Community Policing Review Board, public session. She tapped her pen against the desk once. Then twice. A storm was brewing, and it wouldn't be handled in silence. Because for Justice Loretta James, being dismissed was nothing new. But letting it slide? That was no longer an option. That a week later, the Montgomery Civic Center buzzed with tension. Folding chairs filled the wide hall, news crews lined the back wall, and citizens, from churchgoers to college students, packed in to witness the public session of the Community Policing Review Board. At the center table sat a panel of 7, local officials, civil rights advocates, and in the middle, Justice Loretta James. Dressed in a charcoal gray suit with her silver pin shining under the lights, she looked calm, dignified, and immovable. Officer Walker sat 3 rows from the front, his uniform crisp, but his posture rigid. He hadn't been asked to attend, but skipping it would have drawn more attention. His name wasn't on the docket, but everyone knew what this meeting was really about. Justice James adjusted her microphone. "When we speak of accountability," she began, her voice steady and resonant, "we are not just referring to criminal acts or excessive force. We are referring to tone. To judgment. To the way power is used, or misused, in everyday encounters." The room was silent. Cameras clicked. Pens froze mid-sentence. "I was pulled over last week for no lawful reason. I was addressed with condescension, not courtesy. And when my identity was discovered, only then did the behavior shift. That, my friends, is not about law. It's about attitude." Some in the audience murmured in agreement. Others leaned forward, riveted. "I am not seeking punishment," she continued. "But I am demanding awareness. If I, with my position and privilege, can be treated as a problem first and a person second, what does that say for those with no title to shield them?" The mayor cleared his throat but said nothing. No one dared interrupt her. She paused, then concluded, "Reform starts with humility. Not just from officers, but from the system that made this behavior feel normal." Applause broke out, slow but rising. Walker sat frozen. Because no reprimand from a chief, no memo from a supervisor, could match what just happened. He hadn't been named. But he had just been seen. The speech echoed far beyond the walls of the Civic Center. Clips of Justice James's remarks hit local news within hours, and by morning, national networks were replaying her calm but pointed words. "Power used without thought is not protection, it's intimidation." The quote spread like wildfire across social media. Law students, activists, former judges, even celebrities, weighed in. At the precinct, Officer Walker kept his head down. No one said anything directly to him, but the glances lingered longer. Conversations paused when he walked by. It wasn't official discipline, but it felt worse. He had become a symbol, and not the kind he'd hoped to be in uniform. Chief Reynolds finally called him in. "Brent," he said, folding his hands. "You weren't named. But let's not pretend this didn't touch every one of us." Walker nodded silently. "I'm not here to tear you down. I'm here to ask, what are you going to do about it?" Walker swallowed hard. He didn't know. Not yet. But the weight of the moment demanded more than regret. Across town, Justice James sat in her garden, her morning tea untouched. Her phone buzzed non-stop, journalists, law schools, city officials. But she wasn't interested in the noise. Her eyes were on her notebook. She flipped through pages of handwritten notes, ideas she'd been compiling for months. Now, finally, it was time. At the top of the next page, she wrote in bold ink, "Initiative, Human Dignity in Policing," because one traffic stop may have started this chapter, but she would make sure it changed the whole story. 2 weeks later, Justice James stood once again at the front of a room, but this time, it wasn't a courtroom or a public hearing. It was a police training center. Rows of uniformed officers sat before her, some with folded arms, others scribbling notes. Officer Walker sat in the back row, silently watching. She wasn't there to scold. She was there to build. The program she launched, Human Dignity in Policing, had gained traction quickly. It wasn't about lectures. It was about conversations. Real ones. With judges, citizens, and officers, all in one room. She began, "We're taught early in life how to identify threats. But are we ever truly taught how to identify dignity?" The room was quiet. "I'm not here to talk about laws. You all know them. I'm here to talk about presence. Language. Listening. The small things that tell people they matter, or that they don't." A hand slowly rose, not Officer Walker's, but a young recruit near the front. "How do we unlearn the way we've been trained to respond so quickly? We're told hesitation can be fatal." Justice James nodded. "I'm not asking you to hesitate. I'm asking you to see. To distinguish. Because reaction without discernment isn't safety. It's chaos." That line landed hard. For the first time, Officer Walker raised his hand. She met his eyes and gave a small nod. "I didn't see you that day," he said, voice low. "I saw a version of someone I thought I understood. And I was wrong." A few heads turned. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he continued. "But I want to be better." Justice James gave him a long look, not one of approval, but of challenge. "Then begin," she said. "Not tomorrow. Now." And with that, the room exhaled. Because something rare had happened, accountability without shaming, humility without fear. The shift wasn't dramatic. But it was real. And for the first time in years, Justice James believed this city might finally start listening. The Human Dignity in Policing initiative quickly became more than just a training program. It sparked a movement. Community centers began hosting monthly forums. Clergy, educators, shop owners, and teens gathered with patrol officers over coffee and open discussions. People who once avoided eye contact with police now shared meals and stories in the same rooms. Justice James didn't attend every session. She didn't need to. Her words had planted roots. Now others were watering them. At one of these forums, Officer Walker stood up to speak. "I used to think control meant respect," he said, addressing a room full of young adults. "But control without connection? That's just fear wearing a badge." A college student raised her hand. "So what changed you?" He paused. "Getting it wrong in front of someone who didn't humiliate me, but made sure I saw it." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam a fist. She just told the truth. And left the rest to me. He sat down to a round of quiet applause. That night, he wrote an email he never thought he'd send, to Justice James. Subject: "Thank you, I've been listening. I've been learning. I still have a long way to go. But I finally understand what you meant when you said presence matters. Thank you for not closing the door on me." She read it alone in her chambers, then folded her glasses and looked out the window. In all her years on the bench, she had delivered rulings that changed lives. But this slow, stubborn shift in hearts, felt just as powerful. Because true justice doesn't always come with a gavel. Sometimes, it begins with a stoplight, a mistake, and the courage to face what comes after. Months passed. What began as a single traffic stop had now evolved into a statewide dialogue. Other judges took notice. Police departments from neighboring counties requested access to the Human Dignity in Policing curriculum. Law schools asked Justice James to guest lecture, not on constitutional theory, but on human behavior. Still, she remained grounded. She didn't chase headlines. She didn't give interviews. Instead, she focused on impact. One afternoon, during a small ceremony at the state courthouse, the governor presented her with a Civic Leadership Award. The applause was long and sincere, but Justice James's acceptance speech was characteristically brief. "I appreciate this," she said, holding the plaque, "but my legacy doesn't need to be etched in wood or marble. I want it to live in how people speak to each other. How they pause before assuming. How they listen before judging." Then, looking directly into the crowd, she added, "Don't name buildings after me. Change how we treat the people walking into them." The audience fell silent, moved not just by her words, but by the weight behind them. In the back of the room, Officer Walker stood quietly, watching. He didn't wear a uniform that day. He didn't need to. He was simply there to honor the woman who, by holding a mirror to his actions, had changed the trajectory of his life. After the ceremony, he approached her. "Justice James," he said with a respectful nod. "I'm being promoted to Community Liaison Officer." She smiled gently. "Earned it the hard way, didn't you?" "I did. And I'll keep earning it." She extended her hand. "I know you will." As they shook hands, cameras flashed, not for the photo op, but because it captured something rare: two people from different worlds. One who held power. One who once misused it. And both choosing to meet in the middle, with grace, clarity, and the will to do better. It was nearly a year to the day since that morning on Monroe Street. Justice Loretta James found herself once again behind the wheel of her Lincoln, driving slowly through downtown Montgomery. The city looked the same: red brick buildings, rustling trees, the low hum of traffic, but the energy had shifted. A quiet current of accountability flowed beneath the surface now, thanks to the seeds she helped plant. As she neared an intersection, a patrol car pulled up beside her at the light. She glanced over. It was Officer Walker. He noticed her, gave a respectful nod, then tapped his fingers against his temple in a subtle salute. This time, there was no tension in his shoulders. No power game. Just mutual recognition. She returned the nod, then the light turned green, and they both drove on. Across town, a new recruit at the academy sat flipping through a training binder. Inside was a printed transcript from a guest lecture titled, "Presence Before Power, A Justice's Guide to Policing with Purpose." The instructor walked past and tapped the page. "That's not just theory," he said. "That program changed how we do things here." Back at the courthouse, Justice James stood at the large window in her chambers, overlooking the Capitol steps. A knock came at her door. Maya, her clerk, peeked in. "They're ready for you downstairs." Justice James turned, smoothed her blazer, and reached for her folder. "What's today's case?" she asked. "No case today," Maya smiled. "You're giving the keynote at the Law and Ethics Forum." Justice James chuckled. "Right. More speeches. But this one felt different. This one would be to the next generation of attorneys, policymakers, and public servants. And when she walked up to that podium, she wouldn't just be a judge. She'd be a living example. That dignity, once demanded, once taught, could ripple outward and reshape everything it touched. And sometimes, it all starts with one moment. One mistaken assumption. And one woman who refused to let it go unanswered. The auditorium at the Law and Ethics Forum was standing room only. Students, professors, journalists, and local leaders packed the space. The air buzzed with anticipation as Justice Loretta James stepped onto the stage. She paused behind the podium, letting the silence settle. "I want to tell you a story," she began. "But not the one you've seen in the headlines." The audience leaned in. "This story isn't about a traffic stop. It's not about a badge or a bench. It's about choice. The choice to see people instead of profiles. The choice to respond instead of react. And the hardest one of all, the choice to confront our own blind spots, especially when it's uncomfortable." She walked out from behind the podium, speaking now without notes. "I wasn't pulled over because I broke the law. I was pulled over because someone mistook my calm for concealment. My age for confusion. My silence for guilt. But I'm not angry. I'm resolved. Her voice grew firmer. Resolved to use that moment to build something. Not destroy. Resolved to teach, not just from the bench, but from the heart. She let that linger. Law is not just statutes and precedent. It is how you carry it into a room. Into a conversation. Into a conflict. Applause rose, slow and steady. But she wasn't finished. Don't just become attorneys. Become listeners. Don't just wear robes. Wear empathy. Don't just enforce the law. Honor it, by protecting the dignity of every person it touches. The room erupted. In the front row, a young woman wiped her eyes. A professor nodded with pride. And at the back, Officer Brent Walker stood quietly by the door, not as a cop that day, but as a student. Later, as the crowd dispersed, one of the organizers approached Justice James. "Your words moved them," he said. "I think you just changed how these students will carry their careers." She smiled softly. "That's the goal." As she stepped down from the stage, the weight of her robe felt lighter. Because this story, her story, had become more than a cautionary tale. It had become a blueprint. For justice not just written, but lived. Months later, a bronze plaque was quietly installed on the wall of the Montgomery Police Training Academy. It wasn't flashy. There was no press conference. But every cadet passed it on their first day. It read, "Respect is not reactive, it is constant. Justice is not a role, it is a responsibility." Justice Loretta James, by then, the Human Dignity in Policing initiative had expanded statewide. Schools had adopted versions of the training into their civics curriculum. Community liaisons now stood beside officers during outreach events. And traffic stops. They didn't vanish, but they changed. One afternoon, Justice James visited a local high school to speak to a civics class. As she walked through the hallway, a student recognized her and rushed over. "Judge James, my brother's in the academy. He talks about you like you're part of the training manual." She chuckled. "Tell him I hope I'm not the boring part." The student grinned. "He says you changed the whole culture. That now they teach more than rules, they teach respect." That night, at home, Loretta James sat alone in her study. The sun had dipped low behind the trees. Her silver pin rested in a dish beside her reading glasses. She didn't need the title to remind her who she was. She opened an old leather-bound journal and wrote, "It began with silence. It ended with understanding. But only because I chose to speak." She closed the book gently. Because some stories don't need a courtroom to make their mark. They live in how people choose to treat one another. In who they choose to become after getting it wrong. And in one quiet, unwavering truth, dignity is not a privilege. It's a right. Years later, long after Justice Loretta James had stepped down from the bench, her influence continued to ripple through the institutions she once served, and the people she quietly transformed. At a dedication ceremony outside the newly renamed Loretta James Center for Justice Integrity, former students, judges, officers, and citizens gathered to honor the woman who redefined what justice could look like, not just in rulings, but in relationships. Maya, now a respected attorney and civil rights leader, took the podium. She didn't change the system with outrage, she said. She changed it with conviction. With grace. And with the power of showing up differently. In the front row sat Officer Brent Walker, now retired, with gray at his temples, holding hands with his daughter, a newly minted officer herself. "She made me look at the badge differently," he whispered to her. "And because of her, I wore it better." Inside the center, exhibits displayed the Human Dignity in Policing initiative, personal notes from Justice James, and recordings of her most powerful speeches. One section featured a recreated version of her chambers, simple, elegant, filled with books and framed letters from citizens she had impacted. Near the exit, a wall bore her most enduring words, justice is not what you wear in court. It's how you carry others outside it. As the crowd filtered out and the sun set over Montgomery, the doors of the center remained open, not just in tribute, but in purpose. Because Justice Loretta James was never interested in statues or ceremonies. She was interested in change, real, lasting, human change. And now, even in her absence, that legacy breathed through every oath sworn with humility. Every officer who paused before assuming. Every citizen who stood their ground with quiet courage. And every story that reminded the world, one voice, calm, clear, and unwavering, can rewrite everything. Justice James didn't just serve the law. She taught it how to see. And how to feel.